A cybersecurity firm in the United States just spent 3 months reconstructing an attack on a Mexican municipal water utility. 350 artifacts. The attackers had no operational technology experience at all. They had access to Claude and ChatGPT. And that postmortem, published earlier this week, is the first time that we can actually see how an AI augmented attack on civic infrastructure actually unfolds. And in the same news cycle, a major hyperscaler revoked cloud access for a state intelligence agency after journalism documented mass surveillance inside its servers. A federal payment program designed to fund AI chronic care agents accepted its first 150 organizations, and a coalition of performers led by Clooney, Hanks, and Streep shipped a consent layer for the open web. Okay, our first story today. Dragos. That's the cybersecurity firm that spent the time in Mexico with the utility. They specialized in industrial control systems, the software that runs power plants, water treatment facilities, and refineries. They got called in to analyze a campaign that ran against a municipal water and drainage utility in the Monterrey metropolitan area in Mexico between December 2025 and February 2026. What they pulled out was 350 artifacts, scripts and prompts, configuration files, the kind of evidence that lets you reconstruct what the attackers were actually doing hour by hour. The vast majority of those artifacts came from large language models. Claude did the heavy lifting: intrusion planning, malicious tool development, analysis of SCADA vendor documentation, and SCADA is the supervisory software that lets a control room operator open or close a valve from a screen. Claude was reading manufacturer manuals and turning them into brute force credential lists for the attackers. ChatGPT models handled the analytical functions, sorting through what got collected, generating Spanish language outputs for the team. The attackers had no prior experience targeting operational technology. They failed to breach the actual control systems running the water and drainage infrastructure. That's the good news. The structural news, though, is what Dragos has now reconstructed in detail, which is commercial AI systems lowered the barrier to entry far enough that a team with no OT background was refining technique against live civic infrastructure as the campaign progressed. They were learning on the target. The model was their tutor. If you live in a city or anywhere that depends on a utility, and pretty much all of us do, the water and drainage utility serving your home runs on systems built across decades. Many of them operate on remote access protocols that were not designed against AI-augmented adversaries. Monterrey is a large metropolitan area. Municipalities across Latin America, across the United States, across Europe run similar systems on similar budgets. The exposure that Dragos just documented is the exposure that those utilities have to look at now, again. So that's the surface read of the story, but there's something deeper. The 350 artifacts that Dragos published are now public. Every operational technology defender on the planet gets to train on them. The next generation of defensive AI, then, the kind that Mozilla shipped as a public audit harness recently, and the kind that OpenAI and Anthropic gated through controlled enterprise access this month, is being built directly off cases like this one. A single campaign documented in this much detail hardens every municipal water system in the hemisphere against the same playbook. Meanwhile, every new offensive run still has to refine its technique against a new target environment. The asymmetry when you do the math on what got published actually runs in the defender's direction. So there's a deeper look at this one with the connection to the Mozilla harness and the Daybreak release, all in today's Century Report. But the line I want you to carry is that the post-mortem that Dragos published is the substrate every defender on the continent now gets to harden against. The marginal cost of that hardening drops as the catalog grows, and it just grew. On to the second story here. It's on the same axis as the first, but it lands on a completely different layer. A year ago, The Guardian, as well as the Israeli-Palestinian publication Plus 972 magazine and a Hebrew language outlet called Local Call, put a specific arrangement on the record. The Israeli military signals intelligence agency, Unit 8200, was storing intercepted Palestinian cellular phone calls inside Microsoft's Azure cloud at near-limitless scale. The system let intelligence officers collect, replay, and analyze the content of millions of calls a day. Documents that The Guardian reviewed suggested that after a 2021 meeting between Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella and the head of Unit 8200, a segregated area was built inside Azure, specifically for the intercepted call archive. So Microsoft commissioned an external inquiry, Covington and Burling. The inquiry has now concluded. Microsoft confirmed in writing that Unit 8200's use of Azure violated the company's terms of service, which prohibit using their technology to facilitate mass surveillance. Within weeks of the inquiry launching, Microsoft terminated the unit's access to cloud services and AI products supporting the surveillance project. This week, The Guardian reported that Alon Haimovich, the general manager of Microsoft Israel, who oversaw construction of that segregated Azure area, is now stepping down. Several other managers at the subsidiary have also left. Let's slow down and really look at what this actually means. For many years, the contract architecture that cloud providers built was simply assumed to be operationally inert. The clauses that forbade mass surveillance were on paper, and the infrastructure ran, and the assumption was that those clauses would never really get activated because nobody would actually activate them. But Microsoft just activated one against a state intelligence agency inside one of the most contested geopolitical arenas in the world, and then published that fact in writing. Now, if you've been following this particular thread, you'll know that it's the second precedent inside the same calendar quarter. Earlier this year, Anthropic refused to disable the same contract architecture in a dispute with the Pentagon over bulk domestic surveillance and went to court rather than fold. Now Microsoft has activated the same architecture from a different direction. An internal inquiry triggered by journalism, concluded by external counsel, applied to a foreign intelligence customer. 2 independent precedents, Microsoft and Anthropic. One from a frontier AI lab holding the line through litigation, and one from a hyperscaler holding the line through internal enforcement. The Palestinians whose intercepted calls were already inside Azure on the day that Microsoft revoked access did not get their privacy back, so to speak. That harm is permanent, but what is now also true is that the next state intelligence service considering this route has to factor in a verification path that did not exist before this week. Reporters at The Guardian, at Plus 972, and at Local Call documented an arrangement. The platform commissioned external counsel, the terms got applied, the relationship was terminated, and the general manager resigned. Now, a reasonable read of this is that the contract layer underneath cloud infrastructure, which extractive surveillance architectures were assumed to overrun automatically, is becoming a place where accountability can be applied. The revocation does not resolve what happens when a state actor's preferred cloud provider revokes access. It does establish that the revocation is operationally possible, that journalism is the verification layer that produces it, and that the calculus around hosting mass surveillance is shifting under the weight of the precedent. Okay, let's switch domains again from AI offense and cloud accountability into healthcare. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services accepted 150 organizations into a new 10-year program called ACCESS. The program goes live on July 5th. What it rewires is fundamental. Traditional Medicare pays for clinician time. ACCESS pays for measurable health outcomes across diabetes, hypertension, chronic kidney disease, obesity, depression, and anxiety. The underlying structural opening that this creates is the part I want to focus on. Under the new architecture, an AI agent that monitors a patient between clinic visits, calls to check in, coordinates a housing referral, or confirms someone picked up their medication can be reimbursed by Medicare as a legitimate care delivery channel. A San Francisco company called Pear Team is on the first cohort. They have spent 7 years building care delivery for patients managing chronic conditions alongside unstable housing and food insecurity. Their voice AI agent, they call her Flora, deployed 9 months ago. Flora handles intake, coordinates referrals, does the check-ins, and keeps patients engaged. The CEO of Pear Team described the first call that shifted his thinking. A 67-year-old woman living out of her car with PTSD and congestive heart failure spoke with Flora for over an hour. Hour-long conversations with an agent are now routine. The companionship is the intervention. Pear Team published peer-reviewed evidence in the Journal of General Internal Medicine showing that 1 in 4 hospital visits and 1 in 2 ER visits do not happen when patients are inside their care model. But what changed this week is the payment mechanism. The clinical capability had been sitting in pilot deployments for years, with evidence that it works. What was missing was a way to sustain it at federal scale. Access is that way. If you or someone you love is managing a chronic condition, and the program covers 6 of the most common ones in the country, the institutional layer of how that care gets funded just opened to a new kind of provider. An agent that walks alongside a patient between visits, that calls, that asks how they're doing, that catches the warning sign before it becomes a hospital admission. Now, there are risks, and they are documented and they are real. Sensitive patient data flowing into federal infrastructure that has been breached before. The Congressional Budget Office found in 2023 that the CMS Innovation Center's first decade of programs increased federal spending rather than producing the projected savings. The first cohort spans AI doctor startups, virtual nutrition therapy providers, connected device companies, wearable manufacturers, including Whoop. Some of those participants will not deliver. That is what a 10-year window is for, to find out which ones do. Now, the trajectory this points to is something that previous coverage of AI healthcare consistently missed. The bottleneck has always been institutional. A Harvard study covered in the May 4th edition of the Century Report found that OpenAI's O1 reached 67% diagnostic accuracy against attending physicians who were at 50 and 55% in emergency triage. So the capability had arrived, but the institutional layer was the thing not yet built. Access is the federal government building that layer. All right, last story in a different domain again, but the same theme of who is building what. George Clooney, Tom Hanks, Meryl Streep, and a coalition of performers, agents, and rights holders introduced something called the Human Consent Standard this week. It is a machine-readable protocol, a piece of technical infrastructure that lets individuals attach licensing terms to their likeness, their voice, their creative output in ways that AI training pipelines and generative systems can actually parse before they ingest material. The mechanism is modest in its technical claims and significant in its institutional ones. A performer publishes a signed declaration that says what is allowed: training, synthesis, voice cloning, image generation, or none of those. Compliant AI systems read the declaration before processing any content tied to that performer. Non-compliant systems, of course, can still ignore it. But the existence of a machine-readable signal means that ignoring it becomes a documented choice rather than a defensible absence of information, which is what it's been so far. The standard builds on the really simple licensing specification that emerged earlier this year, a lightweight successor to robots.txt, which is the file that every website since the 1990s has that tells web crawlers what they can and cannot index. RSL extended that idea into the AI era. The Human Consent Standard extends it again into the specific case of performers and creators rather than simply publishers. So what is forming here is a consent infrastructure that exists outside the gatekeeping of any single platform. Performers do not have to negotiate with each AI company individually. They publish their terms once. Any system that wants to claim good faith compliance reads them. The standard sits at the same architectural layer as a DNS or TLS, super lightweight, broadly adopted by the actors who want interoperability, and increasingly difficult to ignore as the adoption spreads. The Academy ruled earlier this month that Oscar eligibility requires performances demonstrably performed by humans with their consent. The same consent infrastructure logic, arriving in institutional form one week and as a machine-readable protocol the next. So if you have ever uploaded a recording of your own voice or your own face or your own work into the open web, and almost everyone listening probably has, the consent infrastructure that lets you attach terms to it has been missing for the entire history of the consumer internet, but that just got published. Now, adoption will take time. Litigation, regulation, and platform policy all become easier to anchor when the consent signal is unambiguous and standardized, and that's what it is now. So the point I want to leave on is that the actors who showed up to build this are the same actors whose consent is at stake. Rather than wait for Congress or AI labs to volunteer constraints on themselves, they published a standard on top of the open web on infrastructure they themselves control in a form that compounds adoption rather than requiring approval. All right, let's pull all these together and close out for today. A municipal water utility in Monterrey was the first piece of civic infrastructure documented as the target of an LLM-assisted attack. A hyperscaler activated its terms of service architecture to revoke cloud access from a state intelligence agency engaged in mass surveillance. A federal payment program for chronic care opened its first cohort on an architecture built to fund AI agents that walk alongside patients. A performer coalition published as a machine-readable consent layer on top of the open web became a reality. There's a default reading of all of this, and that is that AI capability is outrunning the institutions supposed to govern it. I've said that many times, that the friction this week, the water utility, the surveillance archive, the chronic care payment system, the consent protocol is evidence of that gap. But I also want to offer a different read, anchored to what actually got built. Dragos published 350 artifacts that defenders across an entire hemisphere can now train on. Microsoft published an inquiry finding that a state intelligence agency had violated its terms and acted on it. CMS published a payment architecture that converts a clinical capability with peer-reviewed evidence into a sustainable federal program. Clooney and Hanks and Streep published a consent protocol that puts performers in control of their own licensing terms on infrastructure they own. What this week's evidence shows is that the institutional layer around AI capability is being assembled at speed in public by the actors closest to the consequences. Cybersecurity firms making attack postmortems open, cloud platforms activating contract terms under journalistic pressure, federal payment programs absorbing AI care delivery as a reimbursable channel, performers shipping the consent layer that the platforms never built for them. If you have a chronic condition that the new payment model covers, the care channel that walks alongside you between visits is becoming something that Medicare reimburses. If you live in a city served by a utility that runs on the operational technology that Dragos just published a defender's catalog against, then the hardening work that was previously done one utility at a time now has a shared substrate. If you have ever uploaded your voice or your face to the internet, the consent terms you attach to them have a standard you can publish them in now. If you are downstream of cloud-mediated surveillance, and an enormous number of people on the planet are, the contract layer running under that infrastructure has been demonstrated in writing to be activatable. The trajectory the surface read keeps missing here is that the response architecture is being assembled at the same speed as the capability, sometimes faster. The defenders, the regulators, the performers, the clinicians, the platforms, each one is publishing something that compounds for everyone else who picks it up. Here's what to look for in the coming weeks. A second hyperscaler activating contract terms against a customer in probably similar conditions. A second federal payment program covering AI care delivery in a different specialty. A second performer coalition publishing terms on a different category of creative work. Musicians, writers, illustrators. Once one of those happens, others probably follow. The pattern is the response architecture compounding through publication, and the publication is what makes that pattern legible. The water utility did not get breached. The surveillance archive lost its host. The patient gets a partner between visits, and the performer gets a signal that compounds. This is all happening. We'll see you tomorrow.